Psychic kid gives remedy to millionaire with 3 days to live. Then he feels a sharp pain in his chest and faints. Then they discover something terrifying. Please rate my story from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The metallic clang echoed through the afternoon like a sentence of pain. 4-year-old Lily cowered in the corner of the kitchen, her big eyes fixed on the spoon, heating on the old stove. Her Aunt Carol held the utensil with cruel precision, her eyes bloodshot from the whiskey she'd been drinking since noon. "You're a curse on this house," Carol, 38, snarled, her voice slurred. "Because of you, my sister's gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the child's thin arm, leaving a red mark that joined the other scars, dotting her delicate skin. Lily bit her lip to keep from screaming too loud. She'd learned that screams only enraged Carol, who used to work at City Hall before getting fired for constant absenteeism. Across the street, in the window of his luxury apartment in Beacon Hill, 52-year-old Mr. Thompson nearly dropped his coffee cup. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the dilapidated Victorian house across the street, a faded yellow structure that clashed with the elegance of his modern building. "Must be some kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, straightening his tie before returning to work. As the owner of the largest construction firm in the region, Thompson Construction, he was used to solving complex problems, but preferred to keep his distance from other people's dramas. Especially after 5 years of living alone since he lost his wife in a car accident one rainy night, a tragedy he'd prefer to forget. His investments in the stock market had only increased his fortune in recent years, allowing him a life of absolute comfort. He kept part of his wealth in Bitcoin and other assets, building a fortune that seemed endless, but all that money couldn't fill the void in his chest. Lily ran to the small back room, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum softly a song her mother used to sing, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she cooked, a folk song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the Victorian house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something different from mere annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. Next door to the Victorian, 61-year-old retired teacher Mrs. Davison was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years of teaching, she developed a sixth sense for children in distress. And that voice carried a pain that made her heart clench. "That's odd," she thought, observing the windows of the house. The family had always been troubled, but ever since the aunt took custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that residence. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. The educator dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had properly talked to the child's aunt, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little one better. The businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before the accident that took his wife. That woman was kind, always humming while organizing the construction firm's files. Then, suddenly, She had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again, until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to suffer in silence. The sun began to set over the hills when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers squeezed the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the millionaire closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't fully understand yet. For the first time in years, he felt that maybe it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell over the historic town of Salem, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running from his responsibilities and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore a child's suffering. Neither of them knew that their lives were about to intertwine in a way that would change everything forever. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical hustle and bustle of the historic town, awakening for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something about that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the Victorian house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. Carol opened the door with a swollen face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," said the teacher with her gentlest smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper conversation." Carol hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Davison, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The educator took a step forward, forcing the woman to retreat. "And I'd really like to meet your niece. I heard she's a lovely girl." Carol's face hardened for a moment, before forcing a weak smile. "And the little one is sick, high fever, better not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," insisted the educator. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 kids, you know how it is." "No need, no," Carol replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a flu. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her, even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams, where a child's voice mixed with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the Victorian house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The educator finally said goodbye to Carol, but not without casting an inquisitive look inside the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the Victorian house, Carol slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouched behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in the room?" Carol snarled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Aunt Carol," the little one mumbled, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The woman laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single apple tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the old stove. They were always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. Carol had locked the back door, leaving the child in the yard under the strong midday sun. The girl began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So, she began to hum softly her mother's song, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the ears of the businessman again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee hummed that same song while working. The woman who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. The woman who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl whose name, Lily, murmured the businessman, his cell phone trembling in his hands. The employee's daughter was called that. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made that connection before? The man put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered the employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, the employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt that the businessman carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. His businesses had prospered enormously since then. His applications in investment funds and the growth of his capital through profits and dividends had made his monthly income something impressive. He kept part of his wealth in gold and other safe assets, building a fortune that could support generations. But what good was all that fortune if he couldn't help a child who was suffering right before his eyes? At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, punctually, the screams began again. This time, the millionaire did not step away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the Victorian house he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. Carol was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently towards a small figure he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the businessman couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? That night, the child slept on the floor of the yard, where Carol had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The girl curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. For the first time in years, his conscience screamed louder than his fear. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the identity of the child, and the guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During these days, He had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 in the afternoon, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few meters from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the Victorian house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of trying a new direct visit to Carol, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the neighboring house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the apple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My God," whispered the educator, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined, much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the little one with her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, my dear," replied the teacher, struggling to keep her voice stable. "Are you okay?" The girl looked quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them very much. They can fly wherever they want," replied the child, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, Carol's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl stood up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran inside the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to Carol's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, the businessman had witnessed the whole interaction. Through his window, he could see the backyard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a genuine fury burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. His companies had expanded considerably in recent years. His investments in the shares of promising companies and his participation in the cryptocurrency market had exponentially multiplied his net worth. He owned assets valued at millions of dollars, a fortune that grew daily through compound interest and strategic applications, but all that money seemed insignificant in the face of a child's suffering. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a brave decision. She put on her best social outfit, took a tray with homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the Victorian house. This time she wouldn't take no for an answer. Carol answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "Mrs. Davison, I already told you it's not a good time." "Dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," interrupted the educator firmly. "And I insist on getting to know the little one better. As old neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before Carol could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom had given her. The interior of the Victorian house was dark and smelled of mold mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," lied Carol, blocking the way to the back of the house. "That's a shame. Maybe another time then," said the teacher, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen. A muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and Carol froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "It must be the neighbor's cat," said Carol quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The educator smiled and nodded, but had decided that she had already seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always here next door if you need anything at all." The teacher's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the educator left, Carol slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl curled up behind the old stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," Aunt Carol accused, her eyes already gleaming with familiar rage. "No, Aunt Carol, I didn't make noise," Lily protested, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. Carol grabbed the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly on the flame. The child recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want attention, don't you?" the woman hissed as the spoon heated up. "Want the neighbors to come here asking questions? You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone on the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the millionaire made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, Bob. "Bob, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the child's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it might be a matter of life or something very serious." That night, after Carol fell asleep, drunk on the living room couch, the girl managed to slip silently into the yard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the apple tree and looked at the stars, humming softly her mother's song. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering. And that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The retired teacher had made an irreversible decision, and across the street, a rich man had finally found a reason to use his fortune in a meaningful way. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at university almost 3 decades ago, and Bob knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the previous night had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," Bob said, sitting down in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and stood by the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" Bob asked, taking a notepad out of his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The man paused, struggling with the words. I have recordings, Bob, evidence of what's happening. Bob was silent for a moment, processing the information. This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately. I know, the businessman replied, running his hands over his face, but there's something else. The employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible, Bob completed, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have needed to leave her daughter with that woman. At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and Bob could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon religiously, but sometimes also at other times," replied the millionaire, picking up his cell phone. "Want to see the recordings?" Bob watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As the lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney. That child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl lived another day of terror. Carol had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol at home. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early hours of the morning. "How many times do I need to tell you not to get the walls dirty?" the woman screamed, holding the girl by the arm hard enough to leave marks. "You're a curse, a plague in this house." The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," Carol continued, pushing the girl down the hallway. "And if I hear even a squeak, you'll meet a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the child was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to hum softly her mother's song, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was that song that the retired teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the supermarket. The educator had spent the whole night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, about the marks she had seen on the child's arms, about the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but full of a sadness that made the educator's heart break. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the supermarket, she went directly to the city hall, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew well the counselor Jessica Carter, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "Jessica, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said the teacher, entering the office without ceremony. Jessica looked up from the papers she was analyzing. "Mrs. Davison, it's so good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger, my neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated." Jessica straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a Child Protective Services counselor, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and the teacher was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," Jessica said, picking up a complaint form. While the teacher related her observations on the other side of the city, Bob was in a similar meeting in the district attorney's office. The district attorney, David Miller, listened attentively while Bob presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," said the district attorney, examining the videos on Bob's cell phone. "I'm going to order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" asked Bob, worried. "With this evidence, we can act today," replied David. "I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now." Thus, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, two simultaneous complaints reached Child Protective Services on the same morning. Jessica was finishing noting down the teacher's report when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services, Jessica speaking." "Jessica, this is District Attorney David Miller. I need you to make an urgent intervention in a house on Willow Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse." Jessica paused, the pen suspended over the paper. "Is it number 127 by any chance? Yellow Victorian House?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," Jessica replied, looking at the teacher with surprise. "Two independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation." At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. Jessica, accompanied by 2 social workers and a bailiff, was heading to Willow Street. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Bob was at his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," Bob said, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the millionaire, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the Victorian house. In the house, Carol had left to buy alcohol at the local bar, leaving the child locked in the stuffy room. The girl continued to hum softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When Jessica knocked on the door of the Victorian house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations: a dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and clear signs of neglect in all the rooms. It was the teacher who first heard the weak voice coming from the room in the back. "Someone's here," she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the door of the room and found the girl curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang of heartache. The child raised her big and frightened eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, my dear," said Jessica, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Jessica. We've come to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the gentle lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by fear. "Aunt Carol will be angry," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," said the teacher, reaching out to the girl. "Let's get out of here, okay?" Across the street, the businessman watched the scene through his window, tears running down his face for the first time in 5 years. His former employee had left her daughter in the care of a family, but he would now assume that responsibility that he should have assumed long ago. In the months that followed, the girl was temporarily placed under the care of the retired teacher, who offered herself as a foster family. The businessman, using his wealth constructively for the first time in years, provided the best medical and psychological care for the child. Slowly, the girl began to blossom. Under the loving care of the teacher and with the discreet financial support of the businessman, she began to smile again, to play, to be a child. Her drawings of birds gained vibrant colors, and her voice returned to sing not out of sadness, but out of joy. The businessman discovered that using his fortune to help an innocent child brought more satisfaction than all his investments and financial applications combined. He had found a purpose that transcended his profits and dividends, a treasure more valuable than all his assets in dollars and euros. The girl, now safe and loved, continued to draw birds, but now they flew free in blue skies, no longer trapped in cages of pain. and every night before sleeping, she sang her mother's song, no longer as a lament, but as a song of gratitude for having found guardian angels when she needed them most. If you like this wonderful story, please comment giving a score from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos. If you like this wonderful story, please comment giving a score from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.